Hello everyone, Professor D here, and this week we will be discussing sexuality, violence, and relationships. The first talking point this week I'd like to talk about is sexuality and gender. This is definitely a topic that we hear a lot about in the news, especially in the political realm lately, and I want to just discuss a few terminologies. First off, I want to make sure we understand that if someone is describing a biological sex or the sex that's assigned at birth, we're often discussing X and Y chromosomes or two X chromosomes or the external genitalia as far as describing an individual's biological or sex assigned at birth. Gender is something different. Sometimes people use the terms sex or gender interchangeably, and they really, if we're discussing that on more of a wellness level, they are very different. Gender is more about a sense of who that individual is in how they identify, and it's really a self-identification. If they identify as heterosexual, homosexual, bisexual, asexual, intersexual, and there's many other gender identities out there that they could self-identify with. And some individuals they choose not to have any labeled identification to their gender, and that's fine as well. Unfortunately, we do live in a society that prefers labels on really anything, especially and including gender. And society can definitely pose a lot of hardships and some stigmas on individuals who are not heterosexual. And unfortunately, in our society, it has improved, and it's not everybody, but in general, many people assume an individual is heterosexual unless otherwise indicated. And that can certainly be stressful for individuals of any gender, but especially those that are not heterosexual. One of the things I'd like to talk about that we often hear of for those that have genders often other than heterosexual is coming out. And this is an instance when oftentimes it's to their close friends and family that they notify them that they are homosexual, gay, lesbian, bisexual, asexual, transsexual. And a student a few years ago pointed out that for him anyway, coming out was not a one-time event. And oftentimes we think of it as a one-time event. And it might be in terms of our close circle of relationships. But he was notifying us that he has oftentimes felt that he's coming out over and over again. For instance, when he starts a new job, eventually there might be an instance where there's some sort of a party, and then when he brings his same-sex partner, that sort of, he feels the need to sort of come out again. Or he also mentioned that he was concerned his landlord was very religious and would not approve, so they rented a 2-bedroom from him and said that they were simply roommates. And he was very concerned if he were to ever find out that maybe he would try to evict them based upon, being a same-sex couple. So he still, and this was just a few years ago, so individuals still sometimes don't feel necessarily as accepted by general society, despite what their family and friends might feel. And there's also a lot of anxiety because they don't know how their family and friends and eventually society are going to ultimately react to their coming out, so to speak. But I think it's a good thing to understand that it's not necessarily a one-time event. Certainly that with your friends and close family, it might be a one-time event, but your life, people are going to be realizing that because unfortunately in our society, oftentimes it's assumed when someone meets you that you are heterosexual unless they're told otherwise. And one of the genders I'd like to talk about is bisexuality, and this is where the individual is attracted to their sex as well as the opposite sex. And it doesn't have to be equal, that it's 50-50. That's not always the case either. And I've spoken with some individuals that identify as bisexual, and they feel that and there's some research discussion around this as well, that there can be something called biphobia, where people of other genders, homosexual and heterosexual, sometimes aren't really comfortable agreeing that bisexuality is an equal gender. There's a lot of bias and stigmatization sometimes toward these individuals, and I've even had conversations with those who identify as homosexual, and they do not agree that bisexuality is an appropriate gender for someone to choose, and that they're either heterosexual or they're not. And that is not the case, and I am not saying that it is at all. I'm just making sure we're all aware that sometimes there's an additional stigma placed on those that are bisexual from other genders that we might not necessarily realize unless we discuss it. So I want to make sure we understand that individuals with their gender identities, it's a personal matter, but unfortunately society does have some impact on that, on how comfortable they are day to day, and if they feel that they have to sort of come out multiple times throughout their lives, whereas those, especially that are heterosexual, often don't. It's not something where somebody has to come out and say, I'm heterosexual, I'm attracted to the opposite sex. So it's just something to keep in mind there when we're talking about sexuality and gender. The next topic that I really would like to discuss is violence. And unfortunately, we do not live in a perfect world. And for some, it's very safe, and there has been no obstacles or hurdles related to any type of violence. And for others, they have been very well exposed to that, unfortunately. But we want to realize that the numbers are growing, unfortunately, and that it can be really, really oppressing for an individual to suffer from violence. And there's certainly different types of violences out there, and none of them are more traumatizing than the others. It's certainly that individual's perspective that will determine the long-term repercussions regarding that type of violence. The first type of violence I'd like to talk about is sexual assault, commonly described as rape. And this can happen to anyone. It doesn't matter if you are biologically male or female. Anybody can be sexually assaulted. It's really about power, not necessarily about fitting a particular gender type for that, whoever the attacker is. And it can happen on dates. It can happen as a random act, but it can also happen with individuals that somebody knows. And that can be really common, especially in children. We have to realize that children oftentimes might feel they're being punished for some reason. So they might feel that they don't want to tell anybody because they're being punished for something they don't even realize didn't happen. And so we need to look for some cues in those individuals. Sometimes it can be really challenging, especially depending on the state. Also, a child versus an adult in a court of law can be a challenging aspect as well. The laws aren't always as protective as we might like for those that are abused sexually. But we also want to realize that if someone is in a partnership, that even if they're married, it has to be consent. There always has to be consent during any type of sexual activity. And just because someone is married, whether it's same sex or opposite sex, you cannot assume that gives you constant free pass to force yourself on that individual. That is not legally or morally acceptable. And I want to make sure people understand that, because sometimes I ask the question in class, can somebody, man or woman, rape their spouse? And some people will say no. And I want to make sure we understand that it has to be consensual. Just because you've entered into a marriage with somebody does not mean you are consenting to every single time that individual wishes to have intercourse. So I want to make sure we understand that. Another type of abuse that is increasingly common, unfortunately, is physical violence. So some sort of hitting, kicking, throwing things at somebody, physically injuring them. This is another one that can be in adults of all genders and sexes, as well as in children. And certainly it can injure somebody physically. A lot of times there's a lot of swearing, violence, a lot of anger is really the only major emotion, especially in children, that these individuals grow up with. So it can be really challenging for them as they get older, regardless of what type of violence it was, whether it's sexual, physical, or psychological, which we'll talk about in a moment. But that can be challenging for them to have relationships because they don't trust, because the people that were supposed to be protecting them, their family unit, somehow failed in that manner. So they have a hard time with trust. Those that were sexually assaulted younger in life sometimes don't value the intimacy of sexual relationships as much, so they might have more partners, which could increase the chance and likelihood of sexually transmitted diseases or unplanned pregnancies. So definitely there are long-stemming effects. And in violence, a lot of times they grow up realizing that being angry and swearing and throwing things is the way to communicate. So sometimes that cycles through and they wind up becoming physically abusive to others as they age as well. And that can be challenging because you really want to stop that cycle. Psychological violence is one that sometimes we don't really think of, because in sexual assault and physical violence, there's usually some sort of physical trauma that someone can see and sort of understand that something occurred here. Psychologically, the scars are internal. They're emotional, they're psychological, and those are much harder to prove. And a lot of times with any result, and we'll talk about this in the next 2 units with mental health, if it's not something that people can physically see as a sign, then if they haven't experienced it, they don't necessarily understand what to do with it. But telling someone they're stupid, they're too fat, they're too thin, they're ugly, they're never going to amount to anything, when they hear that often enough from someone that is supposed to be a trusting member of their family unit, or a close friend, or a teacher, a doctor, a clergy person, someone that is supposed to be there to protect them and nurture them, and they're being told this over and over again. It could also be siblings as well, I don't want to forget that. They might start to believe that, and that can certainly lead to a lot of problems, and we'll talk about that in the next 2 units when we get into mental health as well, that a lot of times there is some sort of trauma, and it could be sexual, physical, psychological, or some combination of all of them that could lead someone to try to seek out a coping mechanism that really isn't as helpful and beneficial for their wellness as they might like. I also want to talk about any type of violent situation, leaving that situation, especially if the person who's committing that violent act against you, you're married to them or they're a parent or something along those lines. It can be really challenging. Of course, children under 18, there becomes a lot of legal issues. If one parent takes them away, especially across state lines, the other could claim that there's kidnapping and file charges that way. That can be really complicated. Oftentimes, if it's a partnership, spouse, girlfriend, boyfriend, that relationship where there's violence, one of the person, the abuser, is usually in charge of all the finances. The apartment, the mortgage, the cars, everything's in their name. A lot of times, regardless of who makes the money, the account is always accessed by them. They might pay the cell phone bill, so they're able to track where things are. They might be able to see where the phones are, somehow have a way of monitoring texts ingoing and outgoing. They might have shared emails so that anything that comes in, that individual can read. And they really want to have power over that person. And they want to know where they are at all times. Sometimes they're convinced that person's trying to leave, so they're really limiting their ability to spend time with family and friends. They try to close the outside world out from that individual so that they have more power and control. And the longer that occurs, the more challenging it is for that individual to leave. Students sometimes state to me that they feel that someone who's more wealthy might have an easier time than someone very poor at exiting, and that's not necessarily the case. These individuals, when they are experiencing the abuse, oftentimes, as I mentioned, they don't have access to the money regardless of how wealthy the family may be. And regardless poor or wealthy, they need to find their own resources and exit strategy and really work toward that. It's something that they need to plan for. Sometimes they need to have a friend or family that they trust sort of stash money for them, and maybe a phone that they can use where the abuser can't track that. I've had, unfortunately, patients that have used our phone to contact the assistance services to help them escape because the individual checked their cell phone records every single evening, so she could not call from her cell phone. So when she would come in to my office, he knew that's where she was going, so he did not check in on that, because she would get a bill saying that she was there, and she would have a receipt, but she would also contact them and start doing some planning while she was in my office, so that he didn't suspect what was occurring. And that certainly is something that they need to sometimes do in order to have an exit strategy, is find an excuse to be somewhere where that individual hopefully won't check up and realize that you're not there, because then that can be a concern. But it can be very challenging. And you'll see in the case study that you're working on this week that I do know individuals who, they're from a very wealthy family, and their abuser is so well liked in the community. He has ties to the mayor, the chief of police, judges. It's really challenging to convince people that this person behind closed doors is someone very different than the society perceives them at. And that's what can be really challenging, is oftentimes those that are abusive, whether it's sexually, physically, psychologically, they're very charming and sweet to everyone else outside of those that they're abusing. That you really have to look for those clues and understand that just because their persona outside of the household is very charming and welcoming, it might not be so at home. So we want to make sure we understand that, and don't assume that someone's making something up about somebody simply to file for divorce. The final topic I want to talk about this week is family. I would like you to just contemplate for a moment, what is family? Is it the same for everybody? And the answer, I'm hoping you know, is no. But what is family? What is family for you? And I always like to ask the question, is family really about blood, or is it about heart? Can you have family members that you're not biologically related to? And there's many different types of families out there. Sometimes you do have two parents, same sex or opposite sex. You have single parents, you have grandparents, aunts, uncles, maybe even older siblings that are raising the children because that's the best fit. Or maybe there has been a death or two in the family, and that's what has resulted as of those circumstances. But I'd just like you to think about, what does it really mean to be a family? And what does it mean for you and in general? A lot of times we're taught when we're young that a family is a mom and dad and the children. Well, is that really the case? And of course that's not the case. There's many different types of families. There's also mixed families in terms of the parents coming in, remarrying, having children from previous relationships. So you have, and then maybe there's children beyond that. So we certainly want to realize and appreciate that maybe the classical definition of family certainly is very different these days. So let's just appreciate what it means to be a family. I'd also like everyone to realize that maybe for us, talking about family and going home for the holidays or going home during a college break gives us the warm and fuzzy feeling. That might not always be the case for everybody. Some people, once they're able to leave home, they don't want to go back because of those violent situations that we've discussed occurred for them. So some individuals, hearing home, going home is not something they want to do, whereas for us it might be. So we just need to realize in all aspects in this class that not everyone has had the same life and the same experiences as us. And this unit is definitely one where we need to realize that if we have not been a victim of any type of violence, which is great, that's not the case for everybody. So we need to realize some people's perspective on things are a little different. I hope you found this video helpful, and I look forward to meeting everybody this week in the discussion forum.